Hey, this is Kevin Jans. I'm one of the hosts on the Contracting Officer podcast, also the president of Skyway Acquisition Solutions and a former contracting officer. And today we're going to talk about the three deciders, specifically in government contracts. For those of you who are not familiar with the sales axiom of the three deciders, there are three deciders basically in most sales. One is the economic decider. This is the CEO. This is the person who has the purse strings, the department manager, the person who manages the profit and loss statement for a division of a company. This is the person who decides whether or not the company is going to buy software or they're going to buy another building, they're going to invest in whatever it is you sell. Then there's the customer. This is the person who needs it. So in the example of the software, this is the person who needs the software to work. This is the person who wants to move into the new building because they're physically growing out of the building that they're in and they want some more space. This is the customer, the person who's actually going to use whatever is sold. Then there's the transactor. And the transactor in the commercial market, in the private sector, is usually called procurement. And oftentimes they're the last person that's talked to in this overall process. So as a salesperson, you talk to the economic decider, you talk to the customer. You may talk to the customer first, then the economic decider. And then once those two decide, a lot of times the transactor is the one who actually closes the deal. And the example would be one of the big deals that I just closed as the president of Skyway. I went through the process of meeting the customer, understanding what their needs were. We went to the economic decider, made our presentation, and helped them understand this actually solves their problem. And then we talked to the transactor. And the transactor is a procurement person who finishes the contract, makes sure all the pricing's correct, and makes the payment. Now, that's not going to apply in every scenario, but you get the basic idea is that oftentimes the transactor is the last person in the conversation because they're not really the decider in who is going to get the work. Now, compare that to the government market. In government sales, you still have this triangle. But what's different is it's usually called the funding authority. Now, that might be Congress. That might be an acquisition executive. It might be the director. It might be whatever the term is. It might just be a program manager. It might be a person that's very close to the contract, but this is the person who decides we're going to allocate $1,000, $100,000, $100 million to whatever thing the government needs. And the second part of this is the user. This is the person who needs the body armor, who needs the service, who needs the SharePoint specialist to be in their building. He or she needs a software developer. They need something. The funding authority says, okay, I'm going to allocate X amount of money to give the user this thing. An example of this would be Intel analysts, people who analyze intelligence data for the Department of Defense. The user is the person who needs someone to analyze that data so that they can use it effectively, okay? The funding authority is somebody who says, yes, we need this service. Here's 10, 50, $100 million, whatever the number is, to manage that data. Okay, well now, the third person here is not a transactor, it's a contracting officer. The interesting thing about this triangle is depending on where we are in the acquisition cycle, or for that matter, the type of acquisition strategy we use, each one of these three sides changes shape. Simple example would be for a micro purchase. Micro purchases are those purchases that can be made on a government credit card for less than $3,500. In that case, the funding authority essentially authorizes the user to go spend up to $3,500. In that case, the contracting officer side of this triangle is really, really small. In fact, it's almost non-existent because all they're really doing usually is just doing a quality control and checking afterwards to make sure that there was no abuse of how the rules apply to government purchase cards. Or if it's a simplified acquisition procedure, which is up to $150,000, the user is very involved in should be involved in some market research. The funding authority is involved, and the contracting officer is helping to facilitate by, I'm oversimplifying this, but getting 3 bids and picking the best one, right? And there are nuances to that, but in that case, the contracting officer side is a little bit longer. Now, this gets really interesting when you go up to a FAR Part 15 full source selection, where you have proposals and you have evaluation criteria and all those things. Now it gets really interesting because all 3 of these players count. Depending on where we are in the acquisition process, they count different amounts. So, for example, long before the RFP comes out, long before when the requirement is being written, for those of you who are podcast listeners, what we call the requirement zone and the market research zone. The funding authority and the users, their side is longer, potentially much longer, depending on how far along they are in the process. But once the market research starts to kick in, then the contracting officer's side of the triangle gets longer because they're actually deciding on what the acquisition strategy will be. Will it be a small business set aside? Will it be a cost type contract? they're using the input from the funding authority and the users to come up with that strategy. Once the RFP drops, which is called the RFP zone, now the contracting officer side is very long because they're the only one that people are actually going to be talking to because of the rules of RFPs. And then we move into the source selection zone where the proposals are being evaluated. And now the user, their side should be the longest because they're normally going to be the one evaluating. And then, of course, the other half of this is after award and the contract administration side. Now the funding authority, they're basically just making sure the funds are being used properly. Their side of the triangle is very small because what they did is they said, okay, we're going to set aside $100 million to go do this. Hey, user, tell me what you need. Hey, contracting officer, go make sure that it gets bought. Poof. So their side's going to be small. Understanding how this triangle works is a really, really effective way to understand how the government market works. The key to understanding government contracting is to understand how the three sides of this triangle are needed. For example, if the funding authority and the contracting officer get together, they have money and they have acquisition strategy to buy something that nobody wants. If the contracting officer and the user get together, they have a great acquisition strategy and a great requirement, but no money. If the funding authority and the user get together, then you have money to buy something and then a user who wants it, but you don't have anybody who knows how to actually acquire it from industry. Helping people understand this triangle is what we started Skyway to do. The podcast, all of the content that we put out is helping people understand the contracting officer is part of the conversation. In fact, most of the time, they can be the actual contractual decider, but they're not doing that without input from the other two. And understanding how all three sides of this triangle are needed makes you a better government contractor and makes the acquisition process go more smoothly and with a whole lot less confusion. If you don't understand how the contracting officer fits into this conversation, or for that matter, don't understand how the other players fit into this conversation during an acquisition cycle, during a competition, during an RFP, during all the steps that are involved, you're at a disadvantage because you don't know what you don't know. We fixed that. If you need help understanding what you do not know, go to skywaydemo.com and get started with our community today. Thanks for listening and have a great day.